Hello everyone and welcome to Conversations with the Dean. I'm Turney Stevens, Dean of the College of Business at Lipscomb University, and I'm delighted today to welcome our visitor to the Lipscomb campus, Kathleen McQuiggan. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thanks so much.
We're delighted to have you. Kathleen is a senior consultant of Pax World Management. You're a former investment banker with Goldman Sachs. That caught my eye since I'm a former investment banker, so welcome back from that standpoint. You're here because you're addressing a very important breakfast here on our campus, which addresses the issue of women on corporate boards. What's the state of diversity in the boardrooms of America?
Well, you know, this is a topic that has actually been out there as a conversation for many, many years, and there's a lot of organizations and a lot of people that have worked hard to try to be advancing women in the boardroom. You know, unfortunately, we're still looking at numbers that are pretty dismal. Fortune 500 companies right now, 16.1% of board members are women. And I think when you look over the years, we've not really had much change in those numbers. It's come up a little bit, but it still seems definitely out of skew when you look at some of the other metrics and other numbers around where women are. That senior management level and women on boards, we still haven't been able to crack to get more of a critical mass at both those levels within most companies.
And as you may have noticed, Kathleen, the situation is even a little more dismal in the state of Tennessee. We're actually at about 8% of board seats held by women. Why are we not even able to achieve a national average here in Tennessee?
Well, I'm not sure I have a perfect answer for that. If you look at some of the research that has been done on this topic, particularly Catalyst, which is an organization really focused on kind of advancing women in business. They would cite really three reasons for women not achieving higher levels of penetration of corporate boards. One would be just still kind of the lack of access to those informal networks where a lot of board members might be establishing relationships and kind of their own network of people they might go to replace a board member when they need to. Secondly, there is still, some persistent gender-based stereotypes that happen, and there's still a lot of perception of women not being able to fill some of these leadership roles. And quite honestly, one of the problems too is there's still very few women at that CEO level, and a lot of the times we hear from nominating chairs is, we're really looking for a former CEO with global experience, and right now women are only about 3% of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. So, we still have some stereotypes we have to get over. And lastly, there's a belief that you can't be what you can't see. And there's still just not a lot of role models out there for both men and women to be seeing women in leadership roles, whether it's serving as part of the executive team or being a woman on a board of a public company.
But there is research. In fact, I think McKinsey has done some of the research to show that the performance of companies that have diversified boards, and this would be not just gender diversity, but also racial diversity, but the performance of those companies is actually better financially than the performance of companies without that diversity.
The research that is coming out really is quite compelling, and this business case for advancing women in the boardroom, which is actually one of the topics I'll be addressing tomorrow at the Boardwalk of Fame cable event. The research that helps justify this business case is really quite impressive. If I were to tell you, former CEO of a company, if I were to tell you I've got a secret ingredient, it's going to help your financial performance. Research will show it'll make your team smarter. Research has shown that it will enhance your corporate governance, will bring a better risk management to your organization, and in some levels it'll help the corporate trust factor, or how people perceive the trustworthiness of your company, be enhanced. If I were to say I have something for you that will provide those things, would you be interested in it?
Absolutely.
And that secret ingredient is women. And so we do see, positive correlation between better financial performance, as well as the McKinsey study, which shows enhanced organizational health and financial health when women have a seat at the table in the corporate boardroom.
I guess one of the things that surprised me the most as I looked at not just the local research that we did in partnership with Cable, but also the national research that's been done on this, is the number of consumer products companies selling primarily to women who don't have women on their boards. Mm-hmm. How does a company selling consumer products not have a female voice in a boardroom to decide how to sell those products to a female?
It's a great question, and one of the other topics of late, there's been a lot of articles. Facebook is another company. We're not totally consumer oriented, but just a large portion of their women users are women, and there's no women on their board as well. And this is where more effort is being placed on trying to find other levers to be advancing women in the boardroom, whether it's educating nominating chairs on the value that gender diversity will bring to a board, as you mentioned earlier, some of those positive financial performance metrics. And also there are other levers that can be pushed. Investors, I think, using their voice to really communicate where they think there's importance and value. And we've seen that with some consumer companies where there have been shareholders that will file resolutions trying to encourage companies to think more about gender diversity on their board. And they've had some success. So I think we need to kind of keep that conversation going, investors engaging companies as stakeholders on this gender diversity on boards topic.
Well, I think the research shows that maybe more than 80% of the consumer purchasing decisions in the U.S. are made by women. The research also shows that the majority of financial assets, in fact, the vast majority of financial assets, are ultimately controlled by women. And so this disparity between the facts and the reality, again, is just amazing.
The stats and just the balance, why we have women over half the population, but yet only 16% of corporate board seats on Fortune 500 companies. A few statistics that I like to point to when you think about women from a talent perspective, women now are 72% of high school valedictorians. Women are 58% of undergrad degrees, getting 58% of undergrad degrees. The amount of wealth women are controlling, with the sheer fact women tend to live longer. Women are due to inherit 70% of the $41 trillion of intergenerational wealth transfer that's due to happen over the next 40 years. So we have women which will be your future talent pool, women which controlling so much wealth will most likely be a good source of your future new clients. There does seem to be a disconnect, and I think there are a lot of organizations trying to help get the research out, engage companies, engage nominating chairs of corporate boards, and engage CEOs. There still seems to be not a lot of CEOs wanting to kind of view this as one of the top 3 business imperatives they need to be addressing to be growing their business in the future.
But again, I think you said earlier that only about 3% of Fortune 500 CEOs are female.
Yes.
And so there clearly is a lack of urgency, I guess, because most of them are white males, would be a presumption. I guess that would be a fair presumption.
There actually are a lot of, I would say, enlightened CEOs, men that have wanted to get involved on this topic. There's recently been a new formation of a group called the 30% Coalition, which is engaging women's organizations, institutional investors, some of these groups that are trying to advance women in the boardroom and kind of try to collectively have a voice. And so I think we are starting to get some CEOs that have looked and said, this from a research perspective, I need this gender diversity or even broader diversity on my board for a risk management decision to have better corporate governance. And so I think some CEOs are starting to get more involved in this, but we need more.
Now, I'm a public company director myself. I sit on a board in New York, and we have seen a great deal more activism on the part of investors. The proxy services are taking a much more proactive stance
Right.
in terms of things like compensation agreements, those kinds of governance issues. So do you see investors being the ones who will ultimately lead the charge to diversify the boardrooms?
As someone once told me, follow the money. And I think when we look at stakeholders for a public company, I think there's a very important role for shareholders to be playing. And some of the work that we do at Pax World Management is specifically trying to be engaged shareholders, particularly on the board topic. Board of directors are elected by the shareholders, and we've got a campaign that we're involved with at PAX, as well as having our own proxy voting guidelines policy to where we will vote no or withhold our votes on slates of board candidates that are all male, or in most instances don't have at least 2 women on the board. So as a shareholder of the public companies that we own in our mutual funds, we will withhold those votes. We'll then write a letter to the company letting them know why we withhold our votes, what we think the value of gender diversity adds to a company, and try to work with them either through having dialogues or providing them with nominating charter language that will help them incorporate board diversity within their board. So, as a shareholder of a company, we do think it's important, and I do think that institutional investors need to be playing a more active role in this conversation and really having companies be more accountable for some of their choices regarding governance, regarding gender diversity, and for that matter, just how can you maximize the value for your shareholders? And we think that gender diversity does add to the bottom line.
Now, we've talked so far in this conversation primarily about gender diversity, but I guess it would be fair to say, although I don't have statistics here with me today, but I guess it would be fair to say that racial diversity is also a major challenge, and perhaps even it would be fair to say that age diversity is a bit of a challenge. In fact, I do have some statistics here that I think indicate that something like 10% of the seats of the Fortune 1000 board companies are held by people over age 70. So tell me about racial and age diversity. Is that also a concern to you?
It is. I'm a believer that the wisdom of crowds, and that there is a lot that diversity will bring to an organization. While the stats of women on corporate boards is low, women of color is even lower, and age is one of these interesting topics, because there is some thought that right now, I think for us to get gender parity in corporate boardrooms, it's going to take us at least 70 plus years here in the United States. And there are a healthy amount of seats held by people over the age of 70. And there are some conversations about should there be board term limits, and I think some of the governance work getting done is trying to address, the role of CEO and chairman. Should they be separate roles? And I think a lot of us feel that they should be. What are term limits? How can we get the most diverse board in? And I'm not sure anyone's got the magic answer, but I think broader diversity on boards is something that I think more research is showing adds a lot of value as well. And companies need to be, I think, finding ways to maybe be trying to think about how they can have the best board possible. I think some companies do want more tools to help them manage difference and diversity on a boards, because you tend to have a lot of boards that look alike. It's easy to communicate, and when you bring a lot of people together that look different, communicate differently, I think there are some more tools that boards need to help manage conflict. So I think there's a couple different factors in there, but I think more women of color on boards is something that is important as well. And we need to find that balance on what is the right age of experience. There's been some interesting conversations. Some very younger professional people have joined some corporate boards, and I think most people have a perception of, well, if you're 65 and you've had all this corporate experience, you should be sitting on the corporate board. But we've seen a few companies bring in younger people, some social media experts. Are there value to having people under the age of 30 on a corporate board? I mean, I'd ask you as a sitting, board member. I think we're having to think about, what is this matrix of skills that we need to be filling for this board seat, and are we really getting the best set of candidates in here that can help us do the job that needs to be done?
Well, it probably depends on the company, and it probably depends on the business that the company is in. For example, if I'm on a board of a restaurant company and I target young families, it seems to me it would be very helpful to have some younger moms input in terms of what the market looks like. Now, I'm sure the marketing department has that covered, and most boards don't want to get down into the weeds too much in terms of operations, and yet that larger policy and strategic vision, I think, is also part of the mission of the board.
Yeah, I think the role of corporate boards has changed dramatically, and so I think I think that there are some resources, as I said, I think some additional tools that boards need to be able to help manage all this difference. But I think there's a lot of value in difference, and I think companies needing to think strategically about what sort of skills are needed to really make their board be the most efficient board it can be is something that I think there are a lot more conversations happening about.
One of the things we're hearing a lot about relative to the board that I sit on is the importance of us being involved in the strategic planning process for the company, that's not just an executive task, that's a board task. And so as companies become more accountable, as boards become more accountable for strategic planning, then clearly the ability to help the management team create a sustainable competitive advantage becomes more important, and that's where that diversified input would be important.
I think that's absolutely true, and on that gender diversity on boards, if you look at just what's going on around the globe, in some ways I think the U.S. is a bit behind what's happening out there between the amount of countries that have enforced regulation, number of countries that enforce kind of voluntary efforts. There's a lot more happening outside the U.S. on this topic, and when you look at just kind of the global nature of our economy, I think it's important for companies to be thinking about, how can we be continuing to grow, to stay competitive, and I think, gender diversity on boards and what's happening around the globe's an important thing for boards to be looking at.
Well, you've opened another line of questioning as you talk about what's happening around the globe. That's a good segue into Europe, because in Europe there's a movement afoot, as I understand it, to create quotas country by country. Each board must have a certain number of females or a certain racial diversity. Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
The quota question, which is probably one of the most lively questions to bring up to a group on the Q question. So, it's interesting. I think if you look at how Norway, which was the first country to instill quotas, when that legislation first passed, the immediate response is there's no way we're going to be able to fill our board with 40% women. And guess what? A little over 40% of board seats are now filled by women. I think a more interesting approach, if you look at what's happened in Australia, it was actually more industry-led than opposed to being government-led. And there were, I believe, 21 companies that actually came together and decided from a corporate governance perspective this was the right thing to be doing, and in lieu of implementing Sarbanes-Oxley, and Australia ended up going kind of this voluntary route, it being kind of implemented with targets by the stock exchanges. And there was also a couple other interesting initiatives with CEOs signing on to be corporate champions. There was also a very active group of CEOs that took on a group of women to mentor to help get them more board ready. There's been, interesting amount of women investors getting involved, as we mentioned earlier, the role that investors can play. Companies started to instill some pay audits. So, I think the Australia model is quite interesting, where it was a bit more industry-led versus the government mandating it. And I think they've shown success in their numbers. And I think that's a very interesting model for us to be considering over here, is how to get some of these targets implemented versus it being quotas. I just don't see quotas happening here in the U.S.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you thought the roles of chairman and CEO should be separated. Should that be mandated?
I think there is a lot of research and value that would support those being two separate roles.
Well, we're in an era of great ethical challenges, and so let's change our focus from the composition of the board to the performance of boards, regardless of their composition. And let's talk for just the few minutes we have remaining about the era in which we live, because I think we've all been challenged, perhaps, disappointed, perhaps, horrified might even be a fair word, at the performance of U.S. companies relative to ethics and integrity, even from a standpoint of profitability of the boards that are responsible to the shareholders. What's wrong in the boardrooms of America?
Well, I know you guys have a great corporate governance institute here, so I hope you are training the next generation of leaders on more of the ethics, values, the importance of governance. I spent 20 years on Wall Street actually doing equity sales and got a chance to see many companies come public and got to see very successful companies that were less successful. I think a lot of it is driven by leadership and what you say and what you do. And I think just the importance of having, a strong culture, and I think really being able to articulate what the culture of your company is, and really seeing great leadership demonstrating kind of the ethics and values that you want your company to represent. I think, we got lost a little bit over the past decade with everyone being really focused on short-term, financial rewards, and no one really has been thinking about how do I build the best longer-term sustainable company. And I think that's really important for both companies to be thinking about how they can be the most sustainable company, but also investors thinking about what companies they want to be investing in and be rewarding for what actions they take. And a lot of the work that I'm currently doing with Pax World Management, we feel that the role and status of women is a very good clue to a company's growth potential, and that the best managed, and therefore we think the best managed companies will take advantage of the talent, the ideas of half the world's population. And so I think bringing this gender lens into your investment process is important. And, I think people really need to think about, what are those corporate governance and those ethics that they, want their money to be invested in, what sort of companies do they want to be partnering with. And I think there's a lot of very good education and more that needs to be done to be reminding people about these ethics. I think it is very important.
Do you think that if the boardrooms of America were more diversified, that we would see less emphasis on short-term profitability, making the numbers for the quarter? Or is that just something that's so deeply ingrained in our culture, largely driven by Wall Street, that we just can't get away from that?
I think it's funny when, I would be traveling around with companies, they wish they didn't have to report quarterly earnings, and the stock market grades you daily. So I think there is part of it that is ingrained in Wall Street and the culture. But I think we've seen so much volatility the past year. I think people are realizing that that there needs to be, when you make an investment, why you're making that investment. And there's got to be a better decision as to what you do want to reward or penalize companies for. And so I think there are a lot of different factors that go into it. There's not one easy answer. But I think we do need to be spending more time thinking about, these factors matter. Diverse boards will be more successful, and they are going to bring a lot to a company. And stakeholders should want to see that. I also think that companies, what they're doing to the environment, how they're impacting their communities, all these factors should be incorporated into investment decisions. And I think you're starting to hear more about that. Again, these are all things that do seem to be happening and be more relevant outside the United States. But I think that conversation needs to be brought up back here as well.
Now, tomorrow morning, you're going to address an arena full of chief executive officers, of board directors, both male and female. What will you say to them to encourage them to be more sensitive to this?
My comments tomorrow are really focused on the business case for advancing gender diversity in the boardroom, and that we're not really going to get into this emotional argument that some people want to have, but really just this is how you help grow your revenue, and it should be a business imperative, and it's good for business. So that's what we're really going to try to focus on tomorrow is, the business case and how all of us can be part of this solution, men and women, in advancing the work of gender diversity in the boardroom, and I think it's a very profitable proposition for companies.
Well, it's great to have you on the campus, Kathleen. Thank you so much for being here, not only today to speak to our students, but tomorrow to speak to the CEOs and others who will attend the breakfast.
Well, thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here and happy to be in Nashville.
We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at the breakfast.
Great. Thank you.
My guest today has been Kathleen McQuiggan, who is a consultant, former investment banker, also an expert on boards in America. She's here to speak to CEOs and board members tomorrow at a Cable Lipscomb University breakfast, focusing on the need for diversity in boardrooms. Thank you for joining us for Conversations with the Dean. Please come back again soon.